for today's event, we wanted to also expand the conversation across different media. And so we focus on film, which has been crucial to producing, solidifying, and at times also challenging the iconic status of Algerian women veterans. I'm really delighted that Viola Shafik, who is a wonderful filmmaker, curator, and also a film scholar, has accepted our invitation to speak about cinematic representations of women in the contexts of national liberation in North Africa and the Middle East during the era of decolonization. Viola Shafik is also the author of 2 books titled Arab Cinema, History and Cultural Identity, which was first published in 1998 and then republished in 2016, and is also the author of Popular Egyptian Cinema, Gender, Class and Nation, published in 2007. She taught at universities in Cairo, Zurich, Berlin, and Munich, and served as the head of studies of the documentary Campus MENA program, and was also curator and consultant for La Biennale di Venezia, the Berlinale, and Dubai Film Festival. She also directed documentaries, including The Lemon Tree from 1993, Planting of Girls in 1999, My Name is Not Ali from 2011, and Arish, Scent of Revolution from 2014. And following her talk, which will be around 20 minutes, Viola Shafik will be in conversation with Oraib Toukan, who is an artist based in Berlin and currently a fellow at the Forum Transregionale Studien. Until fall 2015, she was head of the Arts Division and Media Studies program at Al-Quds Art College in Palestine and visiting faculty at the International Academy of Fine Arts in Ramallah. She holds a PhD in Fine Arts from the Ruskin School of Art at the University of Oxford and is author of the book Sundry Modernism, published in 2017. So thank you so much, Viola and Oraib, for joining us today. And Viola, I will now hand on to you. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Kaiser, for your nice invitation. And of course, Elizabeth and the whole, your whole association, as well as, the efforts that you make for the arts. I highly appreciate your invitation, and it's a pleasure for me. I would also like you to excuse my deficient English. I'm not a native speaker, but I hope you'll gather what I'm trying to say, notwithstanding. Also allow me not to show any imagery, even though it's very tempting, and because I just didn't want to turn this into voiceover show with all the background, and the kind of associative power that is attached to voiceover and image. All right, so you will have to stick with me, my face and my mimics for the next 20 minutes when I speak about women and the politics of representation in the era of decolonization. And I changed a little bit my title, you will see, but not significantly. Gender and female representations in political meta-narratives are omnipresent in nationalist discourses. They have created slogans like Rape Palestine, Mother India, or Misr Dunya, which means translated Egypt, the mother of the world, among others. Implicitly, they are advertising the fiction, or have been advertising the fiction of purity of cultures or ethnicities, and stressing motherhood as constitutional for national unity and progress. The calling of women to armed resistance against occupation, as it happened in many countries of the Global South during the struggle for national sovereignty and independence, and consequently the repeated and positive audiovisual representation of female fighters, seems to surpass the already mentioned motherly and feminine nationalist attributions, and maybe or could be interpreted as a sign of emancipation. Yet, this is again an error, as I will try to show. I argue, in contrast, that these representations have far too often been reshaped along the lines of the legendary Jeanne d'Arc legend, in that they served rather as a means to tame women in their emancipatory aspirations of self-definition, while reconstituting heteronormative male supremacy in times of national post-independence consolidation. Just to cast a quick look at some related theoretical frameworks. Political science, cultural theory, and post-colonial studies have uncovered several gendered ideological meta-narratives, such as the feminization of the East, for example, with the image of the odalisque or the Sphinx or Shahrazad, along with the above-mentioned feminization of the nation. They have revealed different strategies in how communities tend to reinvent and imagine themselves as nations. They do so, as we learned among others from Benedict Anderson, through conjuring and reinventing the past, its traditions, imagery, architecture, language, legendary figures, geographies, ethnicities, etc. I quote, nationalism inhabits the realm of fetishism. Such goes a statement by Anne McClintock. Jeanne d'Arc or Marianne, or the Marianne of the French Revolution, are some of these fetishes of political mobilization. Thus, women have been used as an ideological device during revolutions and the wars of liberation, and were asked to return to their homes with their political subjectivity discarded the moment national sovereignty was attained and the male apparatus ready to reconstitute or constitute itself. This happened in Egypt after the 1990 revolution, where women played a role also. This happened in Algeria as well. In Egypt, despite of female participation in the uprising and the subsequent demands of feminist organizations for recognition of their citizenship, they had to wait until 1953 to attain their full political rights and to be admitted to the polls. At the same time, which means after national independence in 1952, at the same time, feminist associations were dissolved and its representatives jailed while the men worked on the formation of the one-party system in Egypt. In Algeria, after a first era of revolutionary spirit, one generation later, a combination of state and Islamist terror did not only strive to confine women to their homes, but also actively exterminated all those who dared to speak up, as, for instance, Habiba Jahnin elucidated in her documentary Letter to My Sister in 2006. The film shows or speaks about the assassination of the filmmaker's feminist activist sister Nabila during the years of lead, which means in the early 90s. Little wonder, Ella Shohat has pointed out that the weak point of third worldism and third cinema theory in particular, which accompanied the decolonizing revolutionary movements, was to disregard female concerns and subjectivity. Her essay, Post-Third Worldist Culture, illustrates that Third cinema has doubly marginalized women, both as filmmakers and as political actors. She and Robert Stam, in Going Beyond Homi Bhabha, have underlined also that nation is not only narration, but also visualization. And of course, cinema is an interesting field where to examine these kind of narrative visualizations. Algeria, that is in the focus of this talk today, hosted a colonial film industry where native Algerians were practically completely excluded from image production. French rule could, however, not prevent Algerians to be exposed and feel proud of the cinematic products of a fellow Arab country, namely Egypt. Since the 1930s, Hollywood on the Nile produced a variety of genres, some of which directly or indirectly addressed, visualized, and narrated aspects of the nation and its strive for independence. So did some readings of it at the time. In the eyes of some critics, for instance, the effeminate appearance of melodrama's male victims like in the emblematic musical The White Rose from 1933, starring singer and composer Abdel Wahab, were seen as an analogy of the colonization of the Egyptian male and the Arab male more in general. Similarly, films where women played the lead role, like in Bahiga Hafiz. I mean, she was also a woman director. A spectacle, Laila the Bedouin, which was issued twice and came out after some struggle in 1938. So, okay. The motive of the rape of an Arab Bedouin beauty through the Persian king added to the image of the oppressed Arab equal to woman, and this, of course, on the allegorical level. This was in the 1930s. 30 years later, in the era of decolonization, politically committed mainstream-inspired Arab cinema still recycled the same motives through allegorical narratives, for instance, about Palestine in the Syrian fiction film The Knife from 1971, which was also allegorically speaking about rape Palestine. Several modernist post-independent filmmakers like Algerian Abdelaziz Tolbi in his Noah from 1971, as well as Khaled Siddiq's Kuwaiti film The Cruel Sea from 1972, or the Tunisian Sejnan from 1973 by Abdelatif Ben Ammar. All of these films link the figure of the marital rape in arranged marriage through parallel editing to socio-political as well as colonial oppression. So you have to imagine these were, they edited, you know, like the girl who is forced to marry a man whom she does not want. It was always parallel edited with, you know, the killing of for example, for unionists or of the death of a man while struggling to survive through, you know, for his work. So these images were always linked, and well, as a way so to picture oppression. It may not be a coincidence that all these films came out after the Six-Day War and defeat of the Arab countries, which was followed by the occupation of the West Bank, Sinai, and the Golan Heights in 1967. The rape trope survived along with what I call pro forma, the Jeanne d'Arc trope. Yusuf Shahin's Jamila the Algerian, produced in 1958 by Egypt, was screened 2 years after the bloody Algerian War of Independence, which had cost hundreds of thousands their life and caused also the displacement of the millions. The film was also made 2 years after the nationalization of the Suez Canal, i.e. in a time following the Bandung Conference, through which Egypt became a leading anti-colonial figure in the non-alignment movement, among others. I'm just trying to frame these films historically so that you can see a bit the political connections. Jamila the Algerian is a political drama which pictures the incarceration, torture, and trial of a female Algerian freedom fighter, played in this, or performed in this case, by the pretty Egyptian starlet Magda, who came along as a suffering and steadfast beauty, pretty similar to the image, to the already very familiar image of the earliest Jeanne d'Arc films, like, for instance, of course, the beautiful, film from the 1920s, German film. Woman as an informed freedom fighter was certain. Mona was the director. Sorry, I just had a blackout. Woman as an armed freedom fighter was certainly an image the patriarchy had difficulties to accommodate and assimilate. The insecurity and ambiguity is evident in Marwa Aksanyo's video that is also part of your exhibition, when she shows several covers of Arabic Al-Hilal publications that picture beautiful women, you know, with full makeup, pointing their guns at the spectator, while simultaneously questioning women's liability to go to war. Are women able to carry weapons and to go to war? Of course, it is much easier to incorporate the tragic character of Jeanne d'Arc, a marginal and probably mentally disturbed woman, just like the exceptional French Marianne, well known from the Delacroix painting Liberty Leads the People from 1830. It is easier to accommodate this into the or assimilate these images into the heteronormative narrative of a domineering masculinity. The mentioned painting, Liberty Leads the People, depicts a slightly elevated, unarmed female waving her national flag in the middle of a battlefield. And interestingly, she is pictured half bare-breasted, which reminds me of the Amazons, who were said to have the second breast amputated to be able to use bow and arrow. So Delacroix's figurehead is unarmed. Robert Stam, in his extensive analysis of Giulio Pentecorvo's The Battle of Algiers, which is also part of the video that is in your exhibition, he draws attention to the final scene of the film, which is actually not part of your video, where an unveiled woman reminiscent to Marianne, the French Marianne, is carried on the demonstrators' shoulders, frenetically waving the Algerian flag, just like the French Marianne. Little wonder that one of the first directorial works coming from an Algerian woman after the Leaden years quite allegorically pictured the rape of two girls the very day of national independence and in direct suit of their participation in some demonstrations. The film was called The Female Demon. It was directed by Hafsa Qoudil in 1995. As mentioned already, the Algerian fiction noir from 1971 brought the rape motive very early, that is 1971, that is 9 years after national independence. Clearly, Noah's goal was to discredit, and only 3 years after Giulio Pontecorvo's film, clearly the goal was to discredit the feudal colonial system. Yet, still the images may be considered regressive. For the images of our Algerian female resistance fighter were already circulating internationally, at least since 1958. Think of René Bautier's highly iconic Algeria in Flames, which was produced in the same year like Shaheen's Jamila. This is a guerrilla film, also, produced by the FLN and in co-production with the with the Eastern German institution. Here again, we are confronted with an later often recycled motive and manner of representation related to wars of liberation. We see women in uniform getting educated, wearing uniform and weapons, and sharing the same spaces with their male companions, which is the camp and the maquis. Exactly the same representation we find captured in solidarity films on Palestine, on Africa and Asia. Along with the rhetorics of equality and emancipation, they have been also repeated in feminist films by Arab female directors. Just to name The Hour of Liberation Has Come, 1974, by Lebanese Hani Shrour, on the resistance in Darfur, Oman, and Jocelyn Saab's Sahara Is Not For Sale, 1977, on Polisario's struggle in the Western Sahara. So you can see here, there's something like also another motive, one of the female fighter, the guerrilla fighter from 1958 to the late 70s. At the same time, in Algeria itself, by male directors, you have the reappearance of the rape trope. Interestingly, the imagery and rhetorics of national liberation in Algeria that focused on female participation in the War of Liberation have only been revived recently and recycled in films in post-war generation directors, which is also a sort of return to post-memory by a post-war generation, by a generation that has not has not been part of the war, like in Résistante, that was made in 2015 by Fatima Sissan, and 10,949 Women, that was made in 2014 by Nassima Ressoum, documentaries both made by Algerian women. These re-investigations, which may be also read as a reappropriation of a negated past, has become kind of foreboding. In a way, they were foreboding, as you said before, the 1919 hierarch or movement in Algeria. It's interesting how films here forebode actually the actual new movement where women again became emblematic. The resistance fighters became emblematic. However, I wanted to point out something differently also. Along with these tropes and the use of these kind of images for, for political mobilization, we have at the same time also other directions. And one of them, a very interesting example, I could not find some in Algeria, or I can't even, I did not see all the films of the 1970s, but I cannot think of one. But there is a very interesting Lebanese Palestinian production, which I consider much more subjective and reflexive at the same time, which is called Because the Roots Will Not Die. It was finished in 1977, and the director is a Lebanese woman who actually studied cinema in Egypt. Her name is Nabiha Lotfi. And the film was funded by the PLO. The shooting of the film had actually started before the Falangist and Syrian 52 days long siege on Tell el-Zatar in 1976. The siege resulted in a massacre that ended with the deaths of an estimated 1/3 of the 15,000 camp's inhabitants. After the events, the director, Nabiha Lotfi, returned to resume filming with some of the camp's female survivors. The outcome turned into one of the rare documents on Tell el-Zatar and its residents before and after the siege. This before and after has eventually become the structuring moment of the film's editing. Images from before show the vivid daily street life, workplaces, and classrooms, and are interspersed with testimonies of the women. The recordings interchange with still images of the massacre's victims, footage from the Battle of Tell el-Zatar, headlines heralding the camp's siege, collapse, evacuation, and ensuing killings. In the end, it is the voices of the women which form the binding element, due also to the fact that parts of the original sound had been lost. The dissociation of image before and sound after frames women's voices and stories, and the framing of women's voices and stories endows the work with a strongly personal and subjective character. Naturally also because individual loss, pain, and defeat have been inscribed into the narration and not the narration of a victorious nation. Nadia Yacoub, too, who has discussed this film extensively, argues that in contrast to other Palestinian films of the same era, Tell el-Zatar by Mustafa Abu Ali, for instance, which were imbued with PLO politics, Lotfi's film in contrast stands out because it takes the immediate experience of the interviewed women as a reference and turns it really into, or gives them really the space for their representation and their voices. Thank you so much. These are some ideas, and I'm looking forward to Oraib's questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Viola. Thank you so much, Viola. I'm super grateful for the chance to be speaking to Viola, and as part of this exhibition in specific. Thank you for the invitation, and also for the exploration itself. I think it was very, I directly wrote to Katarzyna right after, when I was checking it online, to say somehow it's quite a hopeful question, in the sense that can one day think of any national liberation struggle in terms of how it would be displayed. So not only retroactively how it will print on film, but also how it will be seen and how it can be displayed. And that in itself is a very interesting question. One can now think, I mean, we're constantly doing it, but then how will it be displayed, and who will and display that? And I'm super interested in the choice of artists too, exactly those that you put together. Viola, I have a lot of thoughts here and there, and one of the most striking for me, and I'm just gonna dive into it, rape itself is one of the hardest images to capture, and for all the gore that has come out, all the gore of cruel images on our screens, and even in documentary photography, rape is difficult to capture. And when it does, when it does, it's mostly now used on social media as itself as the moment of oppression, to actually rape and disseminate. I'm super curious to slow down some of the films you're speaking about, and I love how you talk about parallel editing, and how in the end, well, I will get to the end of where sound plays a role, but if we can think together when when the rape trope was used, and if I understand correctly, it is by and large, it is still male directors, and the parallel is, which is a great parallel to sort of the rape itself of the independence project in the end. That's your incredible interpretation, but I wonder if we can slow down to one or two directors and see how that pans out in the edit of a rape scene in fiction.
No. Okay. Yeah, of course, it's good to slow down. This is part of it. I mean, some of that I described in some of my works. So you can also, it's also, you know, readable. You can read that. Well, of course, in the 1960s, 70s. Well, let's now. I mean, how I actually. What drew my attention to this motive or trope, and also it's sometimes really used as an allegory, was actually some writings about you know, the rape as a means to express social difference and social class. So the motive actually appeared very early in melodrama internationally. I found it as early as I can't remember exactly, but I could find that it was in a Swedish document, in a Swedish fiction film, and it was used also in a Japanese silent film of the same era. So this is the melodramatic story where a class difference is, you know, like the oppression of class, it's usually, it was always coined in that context. And of course, it was usually not graphic, and it stayed not, I mean, it remained like that. You could either see it, a hint of it, you know, or you would see, the narration would imply the rape. So, you know, either the girl is now no longer a virgin, so cannot marry anymore, or she gets you know, she gets even a child and has a huge problem because of that. So, and this was used also in Egyptian cinema, for example, all over. There were many numerous dozens of films, melodramatic films in the 1930s and 40s used this trope. All right. Even also later, The Sin, for example, speaks about, which is a sort of realist novel, speaks about the same issue. So this traveled in a way also into these more political narrations. So in The Knife also, there is, it's not a direct, you cannot see it graphically, but it's more or less, you know, this, the female character is a fallen character, and she's treated like one, and you understand that it was the collaborator with the Israelis who has raped her and forced her, as far as if I remember, into marriage. So these are the kind, yeah, and in the parallel editing that I was mentioning, in The Cruel Sea, for instance, there it's more the class issue. The moment the girl gets married, the old man whom she had to marry enters the bedroom, and at the same time the young man gets killed by diving for pearls. And in Sejnan, it's a similar issue. The young worker who is in love of a young girl who is not allowed to marry him, the moment her husband enters the bedroom, and, you know, in this case, it's a bit more graphic. You can see the guy jumping on her, or being on her in the bed, and you see her face, and it's intercut with images of the Unionists being killed by the French. So it's a complete, absolutely put in a colonial, as a critique of colonialism in this aspect. Was that clear enough? Shall I add more?
Yes, thank you. I'm super interested in parallel edits, because so much of post-independence cinema used parallel edits in such striking ways from third cinema, but also I'm specifically thinking of Palestinian cinema, Mustafa Abu Ali, revolutionary films that used this disconnect, and a lot of political positioning came through that, through magnificent edits. But I also was thinking, thank you for widening the question out and bringing in other struggles and continued struggles. It was striking while you were speaking. I was thinking of how in Palestinian resistance cinema, there is this trope of the young female youth who is aspiring to the guerrilla fighter. So for example, in Mustafa Abu Ali, they do not exist. It's a girl called Aida, yani to return to the homeland. Aida writes to a guerrilla fighter in awe. And me and you, Viola, have an essay that we sort of wanted to publish together, where Aida, I find her in an archive of Suhail Idris's Al-Adab magazine. And there's another Aida who writes to the publishers and says, I'm writing you from Saudi Arabia. I want to submit my hair to the freedom fighters. And this is a donation of donating my body, you know, also my physicality to the freedom fighter. So there was the image, there was a female yearning also, so that so the male guerrilla fighter became desirable to join you, desire the movement through the female gaze, but also its flip side. Of course, the Palestinian, even in Elias Lehman's last film, the return of, like you you introduce us to your talk, to the Palestinian, to the homeland, whether Masr Dunya or Palestine, the earth, and its constant parallel to the womb, especially in Palestinian poetry and folk. But I wonder from here now, where is the woman? And I look to people like Marwa Arsonios, who have done such a magnificent job of bringing the collective in and removing it from these individual gazes to a collective voice, which you also end your talk with. What's this move between sort of the physical gaze and this aspiration to an image, back to thinking, no, it's women speak and they are speaking and this is what's being spoken through voice, and how voice can compete then with the image or even replace it if possible. Yeah.
These are interesting aspects. There are, you know, all different lines that we really can discuss. I would like to add just something to it. It's not, I mean, then the attempt of female directors like Nabiha Lotfi or even Hafsa Qudil in 1995, and more recently, the women who made films about then the freedom fighters. This is a kind of then a female gaze on the female, but now it's you know, using the same tools, and with, in retrospect, you know, either in Nabiha Lotfi's case, where you have already the defeat is inscribed in it, there is no, you know, you cannot any longer kind of preserve this image of the Jeanne d'Arc, you know. This is, I also wanted to bring in, you know, the female fighter, or to make this connection. I did not explore it, I guess, sufficiently. I would like actually to do that at one point, because I think there are a lot of connections, because there is this one single woman that, you know, leads the man into a very important, you know, and into a very important victory. And then in the end, and it was a national, it was also coined as a national, actually almost national, between the French and the English, as a national fight. And in the end, she gets, you know, burnt for, and what remains, as if there were no other women actually around, you know, she's the only one. So in that case, she becomes really an iconic figure. And for me, the female fighter, in a way, also becomes this figure. And the issue is also, when she speaks up in the films, then it's always also in using the rhetorics. I mean, if you watch, for example, the Lebanese films about, you know, either the Polisario or the Darfur women, the women are presented with the weapon in their hand, and they speak about, you know, them being empowered and being part of, and that the culture changed, and they really speak as if they have been emancipated. But the idea, but our knowledge, historical knowledge now, is that actually this was, yeah, it was all, it ended in a big deception. I mean, the Darfur, they didn't win, and in the case of you know, Algeria, the women lost everything, if you want, because in the years of Led, it was the horror. They went particularly after women, and it was not only the Islamists; the state went for women. And so this is, so there is something, I mean, now if you talk about the physical aspect, here is another important aspect, you know, where the women, the body of the women suddenly becomes actually no longer the what represents the positive fight, but it's actually something that is haunted and yeah, destroyed. And interestingly, just to end that, and let's go back then to the idea of voice and more to speak more about what you were addressing. The day before yesterday, we saw The Blessed by a female Algerian director, which is a fiction film. And here you have women actually use their bodies in order to confront men. By shaking, their breasts, or by, in one case, there is a scene of a mother who, because her son and his friend, they are reciting the Quran in order, actually, not because they are so convinced, but actually in order to bother the parents, as a sort of adolescent kind of revolution. So at home, so what she does is she, in her underwear, she knocks at the door and presents her body. Say, okay, now stop. This is my house. You have to stop the Quran recitations. So there is this game of actually, using the body and the gaze and the voice. And now between in a way, we're speaking about an intergenerational game of, successions of going back and forth in this. Yeah.
And fantastic. Speaking of call to pray. But also related, I was thinking, the quintessential scene that has inspired so much of the subject is the three bombers in the Battle of Algiers that by default must dress in as non-natives, as French, a woman. And I was thinking of this idea of when she is a freedom fighter, she's necessarily articulating, or there's a fascination with all that is foreign. So if I'm to make a parallel again, Layla Khalid in film was fascinated because she spoke very good English, and it's a freedom fighter that articulated in very good English. Or May Masri's film on Hanan Ashrawi, who herself is a spokesperson, not that she's a freedom fighter, but she's part of one could say, a national liberation project in its beginning, or the way it was explored at one point in Palestine. And she's also a literary English literature professor at Birzeit University. And there's a fascination with her English language again. And in this idea, as though when she is still fascinating for something. There's still awe and fascination. I'm sorry, is it very loud? That's nothing I can do about it. Yes, and so maybe you refrained from that scene as a decision because it's been so overrepresented in the Battle of Algiers, but also Marwa Arsonius brings it beautifully in her film. Yeah, it's just the idea is somewhere there's still as though we borrow the English language or borrow the French dress as part of our liberation over and above the woman in guerrilla outfit or in guerrilla. Yeah.
Oh, Viola, you're muted.
You're muted. Viola, you're muted. Yeah.
Sorry. Again, the same procedure. Okay. But we are opening up here a very kind of difficult discussion, particularly also with regards to Algeria, because in Algeria was colonized for 130 years, and it was not just a normal colonization. It was really, they taught children in school books that this country in France, that we have another territory south of the Mediterranean, and this is Algeria. And if you wanted, you know, to ascend, you know, to climb the social ladder, you had literally no chance else than to study French. And you know, so, and also we have to see that Algeria, it's not just the Arab Muslims, but there were also the Jewish Algerians who are more Francophone than others, because they, you know, they got, because part of, and of course the Amazigh, so-called Berbers, France had this policy of rule and divide, and so they treated different segments of the population differently. And particularly, you know, they created this myth that the Amazigh, which is actually the indigenous population of North Africa, that they are closer to, you know, they are not Arabs, and they are closer to France. This is all part of the game and has been part of the game. So to become Francophone, this was kind of, you had to do that. And and also the education system was all French. It was not like in the British colonies where you could still, you know, get your education in your local language or something. This is Assia Djeba, for example, is a good example of that, where she speaks about where you have actually this kind of, you have a thorn in your flesh already with that language, and of course with the dresses and everything, but it's in the end still it's part of your identity. So you get colonized, and it gets so much part of your identity that you can address your colonization and your history only through that device. And you know, there has been written a lot about that. So this kind of ambiguity in the dresses, in that's already part of reality. The problem is rather with these anti-colonial ideologies, is that they, and as therefore I mentioned Benedict Anderson, was rather, you know, to negate that. I mean, the whole, like this re-Islamization, there is no re-Islamization. It's a new global new global ideology that takes Islam as a, you know, as a source, and and has all these dress codes that they, you know, that they declare as being ancient, which they are not, you know. So I'm speaking about these kind of reinventions of the past. Time has passed, you know, and these girls that you can see in Gilo Pontecorvo's film, they most probably were dressed like that. They were brought up already in that clothes, you know. It's not that they are, I mean, the film shows it that way, but in fact, yeah, I hope I made myself clear.
Exactly, yeah. I'm wondering if there are any questions. I have to make my Zoom really big to see the questions, if there are any. As a, would you like, how would you like to do the, oops, sorry. How would you like to raise hands or?
Well, we have some questions in the chat. The first one is from Hoda El Hadari. Viola, would you, or Hoda, would you like to ask your question in person, or shall I just read it from the chat? All right.
Do you want to go ahead and?
Yeah, I'll go ahead and read the question from Hoda. Hoda, thank you, Viola, for such interesting survey of movies and insightful remarks. Now talking about nationalism in Egypt, many movies after the Nasser era portrayed the same idea of female rape, like in Al-Karnak. How do you see these films in a post-colonial context?
Do you want me to respond immediately, or shall Oraib kind of? Okay.
I think let's go. Let's immediately go, because I noticed the time me and you went over a little bit.
Oh, wait, okay, we're also already beyond. Okay, no, see, in Egypt, I mean, I don't want to hijack this now and you know, speak too much about Egyptian cinema, but as I mentioned earlier, the trope of the rape was also, you know, like in the film The Sin, Al-Haram, was also used, you know, in order to speak about what was before. Which means about feudalism and about the system, and that is no longer viable. So some of these films were also a kind of addressing the new you know, the new system, in a way that, okay, the old system, that was rape and we are now better. Now Al-Karnak is a specific case because it's a film about you know, the rape of and it was made actually in retrospective after the Nasser regime ended, and during the time of, and it was a critique of the regime. So it was here the rape of a female student through social, you know, during her incarceration, and it was a means to discredit the former regime, the Nasser regime, you know, because she was represented as a political activist. So yeah, that's the context.
Elizabeth, do you want to look through the chat? Or
Happily, yeah. Our next question is from Wasera Kamonji. Wasera, do you want to ask your question in person, or shall I read it for you?
Hi, I'm happy to read out my question. Hello, I'm Washera.
Hello.
My question is, how do you think modern films position women fighters to showcase nationalism, also kind of taking into account how it can be shown or replicated through social media and other mass media?
Well, the films I mentioned about the Algerian women fighters, which is, you know, these are films that are in a way historical, because they have, you know, picked out some very interesting or special characters, old ladies who tell about their, you know, their specific contributions to the fights, and you know, the way how they worked, and some of the ambiguities, of course, of the time are represented through the films. And now, of course, these films are easier. So as I said, it's a sort of now a reappropriation of them, but in the light of the more recent concerns. Also in a sort of more modern feminism that is modern, and no, that's contemporary. I'm not saying modern, sorry. Contemporary feminism that is part of the mobilization, as I said, in Algeria, for instance. And so I think that's the role. It's a sort of going back to trying to understand, the younger generation tries to understand what has happened before, and of course tries to reinterpret that in the light of the current conflicts and struggles.
Our next question is from Juju. Juju, would you like to voice your own question, or shall I read it out loud? You can answer in the chat or pop in. I'll take that as I'll read that. Juju writes, I am so fascinated with Madame Viola's presentation. Thank you so much. I am Juju from Indonesia. I also have a concern in tracing womanhood traditions in my own cinema. I would like to know regarding how to archive and have questions about archive and presentation, how difficult for Algiers and Middle East film scholars and researchers to get access towards archive materials surrounding the women's issue, whether in film context or in production contexts. what are the challenges for us as third world film scholars to be able to re-narrate women's position in our own cinema?
Well, that's an important question, actually. I mean, the films I was mentioning, they were rather like that, portraits where the survivors or the women are still alive and can tell their own stories. And very often these films use private archives, which is one way, you know, to narrate history. The problem is rather, indeed, our national archives. Because some of the third world countries, they do not have their own archives, because some of the most of what is still there is in you know, in the West, or the national regimes, particularly the authoritarian ones, they actually, yeah, they monopolize the archive, they monopolize the access. So sometimes the filmmakers and the researchers are actually really between two problems, or are really in a dilemma, because at home they may not get either the national archives are in a very bad state, like for example in Egypt, deteriorating, or they are you know, monopolized by you know, the state, and they are considered an issue of national security. So you can't just step into an archive and ask for any document, and you're investigated for it, and you can maybe even, you know, become scrutinized in terms of security, state security. That's one. The other issue is that the Western archives, they have a lot of images, the ones that they, for example, shot during the colonial era. But here, you have to pay a lot in order to get access. And for most third world filmmakers or researchers, it's out of the reach because they cannot pay for it. And so one woman filmmaker from Egypt, who was making a film about, you know, using some images from the bombing of Iraq, CNN images. She said they are bombing us, and later we have to pay for images of the bombings, which is of course very ironic, but it's a tough quotation, but I like it in a way because it kind of rhetorically puts things, you know, yeah, underlines what's going on. Yeah, so there are actually also attempts by filmmakers to try to pressure, you know, for that to create. There was a manifesto actually signed 1 year before in Leipzig at the Docsbox, which at the Docsbox conference, and there a petition was signed in a manifesto actually dealing with these issues, but I don't think they made a lot of headways here.
Our last question so far in the chat again is from Hoda. Hoda, would you like to voice your question?
Thank you. Yes. Thank you, Madam Viola, for your presentation. I just wanted to ask you about what do you think about the representation of women in the cinema, whether this has improved, where they were given more voice after the long process of decolonization, especially in Egypt, or actually the voice has been taken from them. Thank you.
Welcome. Women have taken their own voice. I mean, you know, now we have Egypt is a fascinating case actually, because, you know, it's the Arab country. Recently, I was, you know, I had an invitation for a Brazilian women's film festival, and they declared that Mfida Tlatli, a Tunisian filmmaker whose film was made in, one of her films was directed in 1994, that this was the first Arab fiction film by a woman, by an Arab woman. And this was kind of, you know, shocking, because it was written in The Guardian and then in the German Spiegel. And actually the first films directed by women, Arab women, were made in the late 1920s, early 1930s. And no one speaks about that. And later on, of course, there were women directors who made films in Tunisia, in Algeria, in Morocco, in Lebanon, in Egypt, during the 1960s and 70s, at the same time when the wave of female filmmakers in the West started also, because women in the West had the same problem. Try to search for a fiction filmmaker in Hollywood. You have in the 1930s 2-3, and very difficult biographies. So the same actually was but anyways, so I just wanted to tell you this. I was so shocked by this. Egypt had already in the 1930s 3 or 4 filmmakers or producers who actually made films, 1 or 2 films each of them, and they actually did not really address women's issues. But in the 1960s, 70s, you had increasingly, an increasing number of women filmmakers who started also to address women's issues, and particularly also in documentaries. And one of them is, of course, Atiyat al-Abnoudi, but Nabiha Lutfi, the one I mentioned, is one of them, etc. So it was more in documentary where you have a real decided representation of female problematics. But meanwhile, we have quite a number of female directors. And look at the film Suad, which had just in the Berlinale received an award. It's about young women from in Egypt who are dealing with their kind of identity and the way how they interact with social media and how that interferes in their daily life, for example. So yeah, let's say it has been snatched from them. But on the other side, there were also male filmmakers who tried, to speak for emancipation or, against female genital mutilation, etc.
Thank you, Viola.
You're welcome.
It looks like we have one final question from Riti Chaturvedi. Riti, would you like to voice your own question or comment?
Hello. So firstly, Madam Viola, thank you so much for the talk. So coming from a South Asian country, and as I've been witnessing the rise of religious fundamentalism and the control of censorship that not only chokes the creativity, but with the power amongst the fundamentalist groups, there's also an increase in the life threaten. How they threaten the lives of the female directors by violence, and there's also instances of lynching. So as comparison, what do you think the scope of continuance of liberty is for women directors across the third world countries? That's all.
That's a difficult question to ask a film scholar. I'm not a prophet, and I'm not, kind of a scholar who is, very familiar with all the female liberation movements in the world, and neither with, the threatening of female directors elsewhere. What I can see, or maybe, from the little I know, is that there are worldwide also, as much as there is, a curtailing of female creativity and activity. First of all, censorship is in many countries also negotiable. You can circumvent it. And also social media, the internet has done a lot in order, also to give some spaces. I'm not idealizing it at all, because there are also many setbacks here. This is one, but there are also international solidarity movements which are there. And for instance, just think of Black Lives Matters, which is now a female solidarity movement, and that has, an almost international scope, founded by women. And there is also the other one, I forgot the name, it's in Latin America, the one that was created because of the killing of in Mexico of so many female workers. And there is, you know, and this has also, meanwhile, it has spread along along Latin America and has now also an international scope. So I think as far as, you know, as far as on the national level, you have, you know, kind of setbacks and you know, post-national regime and nationalist regimes and their, you know, the legacy of these regimes that has been, you know, the totalitarian regimes as far as much, and the militias, of course, who are actually curtailing freedom, not only of women, but also of men. You have, on the other hand, also, you know, like solidarity movements that try to circumvent and transgress them, that internationally. You have an increasing indigenous cinema where women also play a great role, particularly in Latin America. So, you know, there is one bleak picture on the one hand, but on the other hand, but again, you know, I cannot, I mean, this is just an impression. These are some readings that I can share with you, but I cannot, you know, claim to give here any definite answers or, you know, yeah.
Thank you so much, ma'am.
Welcome.
Thank you all. We're rounding out to that time where we need to wrap up, and I appreciate the time that everybody's given us today. Thank you, Viola. Thank you, Oraib. Thank you, Katarzyna.